When people talk about plastic pollution, the conversation usually focuses on oceans, landfills, or visible waste. But there's a less obvious pathway that's becoming increasingly important, and that's the air. Plastic is no longer just something we throw away. It has become something we inhale. This isn't speculation. Over the past decade, multiple studies have confirmed the presence of microplastics in the air, both indoors and outdoors. These particles are small enough to be suspended, transported, and ultimately inhaled by humans on a daily basis. To understand how this happens, it's important to start with how plastic behaves over time. Plastic does not biodegrade in the traditional sense. Instead, it breaks apart through exposure to sunlight, mechanical stress, and temperature changes. This process creates smaller and smaller fragments. Eventually, these fragments become microplastics, and at even smaller scales, nanoplastics. At that size, plastic stops behaving like visible waste and starts behaving like dust. And once it behaves like dust, it becomes airborne. One of the biggest contributors to airborne microplastics is synthetic textiles. Materials like polyester, nylon, and acrylic are essentially plastic fibers. When you wear them, they shed. When you wash them, they shed even more. And when those fibers dry, they can become airborne. Indoor environments are particularly affected. Homes are filled with plastic-based materials, carpets, curtains, furniture coatings, electronics, packaging. Over time, all of these degrade at a microscopic level. The particles they release mix with ordinary dust. Studies have shown that indoor air can contain significantly higher concentrations of microplastics than outdoor air. This is important because people spend the majority of their time indoors. So exposure is not occasional, it is continuous. Outside, the sources are different but just as significant. One of the largest contributors is tire wear. As vehicles move, tires gradually erode, releasing fine particles composed partly of synthetic rubber and plastic compounds. These particles accumulate on roads and are easily picked up by the wind. Urban environments tend to have higher concentrations, but the reach of these particles goes much further. Microplastics have been found in remote mountain regions, polar ice, and even in rainfall. This means plastic is now part of the atmospheric system. It moves through the air, travels across regions, and settles in places far removed from its original source. The next question is what happens when these particles enter the human body. The respiratory system is designed to filter out unwanted particles. Larger particles are typically trapped in the nose or throat and expelled, but as particle size decreases, the body's ability to filter them becomes less effective. Particles smaller than about 10 micrometers can be inhaled into the lungs. Even smaller particles, around 2.5 micrometers or less, can penetrate deep into the alveoli. Microplastics fall within this range. Recent research has confirmed their presence in human lung tissue. In some studies, microplastic particles were found embedded in samples taken from living patients, not just post-mortem analysis. This confirms that inhalation is not only possible, it is already happening. What remains less clear is the long-term impact. There are several possible mechanisms of harm. First is physical irritation. The lungs are sensitive structures. Foreign particles can trigger inflammation, especially if they persist. Chronic exposure to airborne particles is already known to be linked to respiratory diseases. Microplastics may contribute in a similar way, although research is still ongoing. Second is chemical exposure. Plastics are not chemically inert. They often contain additives such as plasticizers, stabilizers, and flame retardants. Over time, these chemicals can leach out. In addition, plastic particles can act as carriers. They can absorb pollutants from the surrounding environment, things like heavy metals or organic toxins, and transport them into the body. So when a microplastic particle is inhaled, it may carry more than just plastic. Third is size-related behavior. Nanoplastics, which are even smaller than microplastics, may be capable of crossing biological barriers. Some studies suggest they can move from the lungs into the bloodstream. If that's the case, they could potentially reach other organs. Evidence of microplastics has already been found in human blood and in some cases in organs such as the liver. This doesn't automatically mean there is immediate harm, but it raises important questions about accumulation over time. Another factor to consider is exposure level. Unlike many environmental risks that are localized or occasional, airborne microplastics represent a constant low-level exposure. You are not exposed once, you are exposed every day, and that exposure adds up. There's also an important distinction between indoor and outdoor exposure. Indoor environments tend to trap particles. Ventilation plays a role, but in many cases, microplastics accumulate faster than they're removed. Activities like vacuuming, walking, or even sitting down can resuspend particles into the air. This creates repeated exposure cycles. Children may be particularly vulnerable as they spend more time close to the floor, where dust concentrations are often higher. At this point, it's important to avoid exaggeration. The science is still developing. There is no clear consensus yet on exactly how harmful inhaled microplastics are at current exposure levels. But the absence of complete data does not mean absence of risk. Historically, many airborne pollutants, such as fine particulate matter from combustion, were underestimated before long-term studies revealed their health effects. Microplastics may follow a similar path. Another dimension of this issue is how difficult it is to control. Unlike visible plastic waste, airborne microplastics can't simply be cleaned up. Once they're in the air, they disperse widely. Filtration systems can reduce indoor exposure to some extent, but they're not a complete solution. The problem is systemic. It's linked to how materials are produced, used, and discarded. As long as plastic continues to degrade into microscopic particles, it will continue to enter the air. Reducing exposure, therefore, is not just about individual behavior. It requires broader changes. At the individual level, there are some practical steps. Reducing the use of synthetic textiles, improving ventilation, and using high-efficiency air filters can help lower indoor concentrations, but these measures only address part of the problem. At a larger scale, reducing plastic production and improving material design are key. Developing materials that do not fragment into persistent microplastics would make a significant difference. Better waste management can also reduce the amount of plastic entering the environment, which in turn reduces the amount available to become airborne over time. There is also a need for more research. Measuring airborne microplastics is technically challenging. Standardized methods are still being developed. As a result, data can vary between studies. More precise measurements will help clarify exposure levels and potential health impacts. What is already clear, however, is that plastic pollution is no longer limited to land or water. It has become part of the air we breathe. This changes how we think about the problem. It is no longer just an environmental issue, it is also a direct human exposure issue. And unlike many environmental risks, this one is difficult to avoid. You can't choose not to breathe. The air around you is shaped by countless factors, from industrial activity to urban design. Plastic has now become one of those factors. It exists in forms too small to see, moving through spaces we assume are clean. That doesn't mean the situation is hopeless, but it does mean the problem is more complex than it first appears. Plastic doesn't just stay where it's discarded. It breaks down, disperses, and integrates into natural systems, including the air. And once it reaches that level, it becomes part of everyday life in a way that is hard to reverse. Understanding this is the first step, because if something is invisible, constant, and widespread, it's easy to ignore. But ignoring it doesn't make it go away. And in this case, it never really does.